How to win in life without any support. That phrase sounds empowering, almost heroic. Work hard, stay disciplined, outperform. That is the promise. But the promise quietly rests on a deeper assumption, that systems reward merit in proportion to effort. And this is where the illusion begins to fracture. I recall reviewing longitudinal mobility data from economists Raj Chetty and his Harvard team. Their work on mobility between generations in the US indicated that the chances of someone rising from the lowest to the highest income group have decreased since the mid-20th century. For those born in the 1940s, upward mobility was near 90%. For those born in the 1980s, it fell to about 50%. This isn't about a lack of effort. It's about the structure of society. The usual message is, try harder. But the data suggests your starting point is more relevant than how hard you work. I was surprised the difference was so large. Businesses continue to promote meritocracy. In 2012, researchers Emilio Castilla and Stephen Bernard released a study in Administrative Science Quarterly that examined performance-based rewards in companies that said they valued meritocracy. Their findings were unsettling. In firms that stressed meritocracy, managers tended to reward men more than equally qualified women. The promotion of meritocracy actually increased bias. When leaders believe the system is fair, they depend more on their own biased judgments. This isn't talked about openly. For workers without sponsors, mentors, or family wealth to fall back on, this isn't just academic. It's their reality. You achieve results. Your coworker does slightly worse, but socializes with the regional director. When promotions are announced, you are told you lack visibility. In other words, your work wasn't enough to get you noticed. Hard work didn't create influence. This is where dependence becomes clear. Most careers depend on relationships, not just output. Sociologist Mark Granovetter showed this in the 1970s with his research on the strength of weak ties. People often found jobs through casual acquaintances, not formal applications. It's about who you know, not what you know. The person without support, no matter how skilled, is at a disadvantage. This led me to reread Niccolò Machiavelli. In The Prince, he distinguishes between those who gain power on their own and those who rely on others. He's not sentimental about either method. He simply points out that power gained through others is unreliable because it relies on their goodwill. But gaining power independently demands ruthlessness, a clear plan, and the ability to control circumstances. He writes that people judge by appearances rather than substance, because everyone can see, but few can truly understand. Reputation matters more than reality. The modern story of the self-made person leaves out key details. Founders talk about sleeping in garages. Executives emphasize determination, but look closer at their backgrounds. Early investors, family connections, top universities, advantageous marriages. Even in Silicon Valley's mythology, support systems are hidden. The story of complete independence is appealing, especially to those who have already succeeded. It turns structural advantages into personal qualities. In the 1960s, psychologist Melvin Lerner described the just world hypothesis, the idea that people get what they deserve. It's comforting. If effort equals reward, the world feels predictable. But this idea creates a dangerous trap for those without support. When they don't advance, they conclude they're not good enough. Instead of questioning the system, they doubt themselves. Here, the theory becomes harsher. If effort alone doesn't guarantee advancement, then it must be combined with influence. And influence rarely comes from being virtuous. It comes from how you are positioned, from having control over important information, from aligning with those who make decisions about resources. The focus shifts from increasing your worth to making yourself essential. Inside companies, promotion committees rarely read every performance review. They depend on summaries written by supervisors. Those supervisors are influenced by office politics. Who's a threat to them? Who helps them advance? A worker without support who does well, but doesn't build alliances becomes a problem. I've seen this happen quietly in consulting firms and tech companies. The most skilled analyst stays in the same position while the more socially savvy person gets promoted. The reason given is leadership potential. That phrase hides calculation. Machiavelli wouldn't call this unfair. He would call it predictable. He argues that fortune favors the bold, not because fortune is fair, but because boldness changes the situation. If you lack support, the game doesn't end. It just becomes tougher. Independence without a plan leads to isolation. And isolation without influence leads to being ignored. Here's the unsettling truth. The system isn't designed to reward hard work alone. It's designed to protect itself. Those already in power maintain their position through subtle choices, cultural fit, similar backgrounds, trust built outside of formal reviews. Calling this corruption is emotionally satisfying. But naming it corruption doesn't fix it. For the person without backing, the first realization is painful. You learn that being excellent isn't enough. You realize that depending on recognition makes you vulnerable. If praise never comes, your motivation fades. If you need praise to keep going, whoever withholds it controls you. So the question changes. If support isn't coming and being good at your job isn't enough, what else is needed? Hard work alone can't change the system. Something else needs to be added. Something less comfortable than hard work and more strategic than hope. This is where independence stops being an inspiring idea and starts being a psychological weapon. But before that weapon can be used, another idea needs to be taken apart. The idea that being moral and being successful always go together. If morality and effectiveness don't always align, something else starts to break down, the expectation that someone will step in. A mentor, a manager, a partner, someone who sees you. When that moment doesn't come, isolation stops being abstract and becomes physical. In 1967, psychologist Martin Seligman conducted the learned helplessness experiments at the University of Pennsylvania. Dogs were subjected to electric shocks they couldn't avoid. Later, when put in a box where they could easily escape, many didn't even try. They just laid down and took it. The conclusion was harsh. Being exposed to stress that you can't control makes organisms stop trying to escape, even when escape is possible. When I reread that study, I thought about workers in companies rather than animals. Junior analysts repeatedly passed over for promotion. Founders rejected by investors 5, 6, 7 times. Consultants whose proposals are always rejected, despite being supported by data. After enough failed attempts to move up, behavior changes. Emails get shorter. Initiativa de crisis. They stop suggesting bold ideas in meetings. From the outside, it looks like laziness. It's learned helplessness wearing a suit. The explanation inside organizations is resilience. Human resources departments run workshops. They talk about positive psychology. But Seligman himself later shifted to learned optimism because it was so easy to cause helplessness. It's not about having a weak personality. It's about feeling like you have no control. This is where fear quietly appears. Not fear of failure, fear of not matching. When no one is supporting you, Every move feels risky. If you take a chance and fail, there's no one to protect you from the consequences. I've seen this in trading firms where junior traders without senior advocates trade more cautiously than their supported peers. Those with backing can handle the ups and downs. Those without support focus on survival. The difference grows over time. Psychologist Albert Bandura's work on self-efficacy adds to this. In 1977, he showed that believing in your ability to perform actions strongly predicts how persistent you are and how well you do. But belief doesn't come from nowhere. It's built through succeeding at things and getting social support. If the environment doesn't provide support, even skilled people start to lower their expectations. Here, the theory becomes uncomfortable. When support is absent, two identities compete. The victim identity says, the system is unfair, so my inaction is justified. The operational identity says, the system has a structure, so I must understand it. Both seem reasonable. Only one creates influence. I've watched this happen in competitive fields like investment banking and top law firms. Two associates start at the same level. Both are technically strong. One sees favoritism as unfair and becomes emotionally distant. He does only what is required, nothing more. The other, also aware of favoritism, starts to notice patterns. Which partners influence promotion decisions? Which cases get attention? Which internal committees are important? He doesn't complain. He puts his effort where it matters most. Within 3 years, the difference between them becomes too large to overcome. This is when resentment becomes tempting. It offers a sense of moral superiority. You tell yourself, I refuse to play their political games. That statement feels good, but it hides passivity. Refusal is still a reaction, and reaction means giving up control. There's also a more subtle form of self-sabotage, depending on others for approval. Research shows that people who need external praise perform worse when feedback becomes unclear. In contrast, those who are motivated from within maintain their output even when they don't get feedback. In sales, this is measurable. Salespeople who need constant management praise close fewer deals in quarters where leadership attention is elsewhere. Those with their own targets, daily call volume, personal conversion rates, remain steady. Isolation makes this difference greater. When praise disappears, those who need external validation see silence as rejection. Those driven from within see silence as neutral. The emotional calculation changes behavior. I was surprised by how quickly bitterness can distort your view. In startup communities, founders who can't get seed funding sometimes shift from making strategic changes to attacking the system. Venture capital becomes corrupt. Investors become short-sighted. Sometimes that critique is valid, but often it's a way to protect themselves. If the gatekeepers are evil, then making strategic adjustments feels like betraying your principles. The story protects self-esteem at the cost of being adaptable. Here, psychology hesitates. It celebrates being authentic and expressing emotions. It warns against holding things in, but it rarely talks about the strategic value of controlling emotions. When no one is coming to help, unfiltered frustration shows in your voice, posture, and email messages. Decision makers see it. Subtle signs of desperation or moral contempt reduce how reliable you seem. This isn't often discussed because it sounds unfair, yet it happens consistently. Isolation, then, isn't just about not having support. It's an internal test. Will fear limit your actions, or will it clarify them? Seligman showed that helplessness can be learned. Bandura showed that you can build your sense of agency. The key is how you interpret control. The person without support who survives the emotional breakdown goes through a change. They shift their attention from fairness to what's possible, from who should help to what they can influence. It's not inspiring. It's a cold adjustment. And here's the paradox that troubles me. The moment you stop expecting to be rescued, you become harder to manipulate through approval. But you also risk becoming emotionally distant for shared values. Isolation makes you see things more clearly. It can also reduce empathy. If no one is coming, you are free. But free to do what? If no one is coming, you are free. But freedom without influence is just vulnerability. And this is where the internal split deepens. The shift from asking whether something is fair to asking whether it improves your position. The first resistance usually comes from morality. Not abstract morality, but social morality, the need to be seen as good. Approval is valuable in every organization. In 2010, researchers Benoit Monin and Dale Miller showed what is now known as moral licensing. In one experiment, participants who first expressed non-prejudiced views were later more likely to make discriminatory decisions. After confirming their virtue, they felt unknowingly allowed to act in their own interest. I was surprised by how consistent this effect was across different situations. Doing something good gave them psychological permission to do something opportunistic. Inside organizations, this plays out in subtle ways. A manager who publicly supports diversity feels free to promote a loyal subordinate. An executive who once sacrificed a bonus for the team later justifies aggressive cost-cutting that protects her own position. The inner story remains, I am a good person. This action can't be selfish. Moral identity becomes a shield behind which they pursue influence. For the person without support, the trap is different. Without visible moral standing, every strategic move feels morally risky. You hesitate to negotiate forcefully because you don't want to seem difficult. You avoid withholding information because transparency feels right. You fear that being strategically silent is dishonest. Meanwhile, others gain positional advantage under the guise of acceptable behavior. Social dominance theory, developed by Jim Sidanius and Felicia Prado in the 1990s, adds another dimension. Their research showed that societies naturally create hierarchies and that people differ in how they feel about maintaining or challenging those hierarchies. Those with a high social dominance orientation are comfortable with inequality and are willing to use it. In corporate settings, people with this orientation volunteer for visible roles, control resources, and shape narratives. They don't necessarily break rules. They see rules as tools. I've seen this in political organizations and large multinational firms. Two policy advisors enter a negotiation. One presents proposals as cooperative solutions. The other presents them as ways to gain advantage. The first seeks agreement. The second seeks structural gain. Both use polite language. Only one leaves with greater influence. Consider Otto von Bismarck. In the 1860s, as minister-president of Prussia, he started wars against Denmark, Austria, and France not out of ideology, but out of calculated statecraft. He joined with Austria to defeat Denmark, then turned against Austria to strengthen German dominance, and later manipulated French diplomatic tensions to provoke war. Each move was publicly justified as defensive or necessary. Privately, it increased Prussia's influence within the German Confederation. Bismarck didn't present himself as immoral. He presented himself as pragmatic. What unsettles me is how modern leadership psychology sanitizes this logic. Strategic ambiguity, for example, is often praised as flexibility. Leaders intentionally leave goals undefined to maintain their options. In studies, ambiguity increases perceived adaptability but reduces trust if it's discovered. So effective operators balance ambiguity, clear enough to avoid panic, vague enough to keep their options open. This isn't lying. It's controlled information. For employees further down the hierarchy, the emotional experience is confusing. A senior leader says, "We value transparency," but withholds details about restructuring until the last minute. The official reason is to prevent uncertainty. The real reason is to maintain control over timing and the narrative. Those who understand this pattern don't feel betrayed. They analyze the situation. The Machiavellian shift isn't about becoming cruel. It's about changing how you evaluate things. Instead of asking, "Is this action morally right?" you ask, "Does this action increase or decrease my influence?" Sometimes the answers are the same. Often they're not. There's data to back this up. In negotiation research, people who prioritize harmony over results claim less value, even when solutions are available that benefit everyone. They leave resources on the table to maintain approval. Those who start aggressively and make concessions strategically get better results without necessarily damaging relationships. The difference isn't about being empathetic versus being a sociopath. It's about being willing to tolerate temporary disapproval. I've noticed something else. People who strongly identify as ethical become more stressed when they act strategically. They overcompensate afterward. Excessive explanation, publicly showing virtue, or self-sabotage. Those with a more flexible moral sense adapt faster. Here, the theory becomes uncomfortable. Having a rigid moral identity can be a disadvantage in competitive environments. This doesn't mean abandoning ethics. It means recognizing that ethics exist within power structures. Even Machiavelli argued that a prince should appear merciful, faithful, humane, religious, but be prepared to act against those virtues when necessary. Appearance maintains legitimacy. Flexibility maintains power. For the person without support, this is the first real breaking point. You realize that seeking approval as proof of your goodness ties you to the judgments of others. If your advancement depends on being liked, your influence shrinks. But if you act purely for personal gain without considering how it looks, you risk isolation or retaliation. So the adjustment begins. Strategic coldness quietly enters. You start measuring conversations for what you can learn from them. You delay responses, not out of spite, but to shift the dynamics. You choose which battles to fight for moral reasons and which to instrumentalize. And the question lingers, sharper now. If you can separate morality from influence, even temporarily, what prevents you from sliding from adapting to being opportunistic? Where's the line? And who decides when you've crossed it? If morality can be bent to gain influence, the next question becomes more practical and less philosophical. What creates influence in the first place? Not intention, not confidence, something quieter, something that grows before anyone notices. In 1970, economist George Akerlof released The Market for Lemons, showing how unequal information distorts markets. When one person knows more about the quality of a product than the other, transactions become unfair. Inferior goods drive out superior ones because buyers can't tell the difference. It was a theory about used cars, but also quietly described human hierarchies. Whoever controls key information controls perceived value. Behavioral economics confirms this repeatedly. In ultimatum game experiments, when one participant knows more about available resources than the other, bargaining power shifts dramatically. The informed person can start negotiations strategically, shape expectations, and manipulate how fair things seem. The uninformed person negotiates within limits they don't see. Inside companies, this isn't just theoretical, it's how things work. Budget allocations, restructuring plans, merger discussions, they circulate in small groups before announcements reach the organization. By the time the information is shared, decisions have already been made. Employees see this as betrayal. Leadership calls it operational necessity. I once saw an internal power shift at a multinational tech firm. A mid-level director learned months in advance that a product line would be cut back. Instead of protesting, he quietly reassigned his strongest team members to projects connected to executive interests. When layoffs were announced, his division seemed strategically aligned with future growth. Colleagues said he was lucky. He had simply controlled the flow of information. The person without support can't overpower the hierarchy, but they can manage their information. This is the part that is rarely romanticized. It's not dramatic. It's quiet. You attend meetings not to be seen, but to gather information. You listen for casual comments about upcoming projects. You observe who gets unscheduled calls from senior leaders. Patterns show the direction things are moving long before official announcements. Intelligence agencies operate on the same principles. In intelligence communities like the Central Intelligence Agency or the British Secret Intelligence Service, the principle of compartmentalization governs access. No single agent has the full picture. Information is shared only when necessary. Not because they don't trust each other, but because control requires unequal information. Sharing information reduces maneuverability. Corporate leaders do this instinctively. Being vague about future plans maintains their options. Employees who demand full information in the name of fairness often underestimate the cost of making everything public. Once information is out, reactions are harder to manage. Markets react, competitors adapt, internal groups mobilize. But here's where the psychological conflict becomes sharp. Transparency feels ethical. Being secretive feels manipulative. Yet in environments without support, being completely forthcoming can be self-destructive. If you reveal every goal, every doubt, every plan, you give up predictability. Predictable people are easier to control. Selective vulnerability becomes a tool. Research shows that leaders who share personal struggles in a controlled way are seen as more authentic and trustworthy. But the key is controlled. Leaders who share too many problems lose authority. Those who share nothing seem distant. Finding the right balance matters. I was surprised by how measurable this is in organizational studies. Small increases in perceived authenticity can significantly increase how likely a team is to follow instructions. For the person without support, selective vulnerability works differently. Sharing frustration with the wrong person can make you seem unstable. Sharing strategic uncertainty with a competitor can lead to being used. Yet refusing to share anything isolates you further. So the game becomes about how you share information. What do you reveal, to whom, and when? I've noticed junior partners at law firms guarding crucial client details, even from their colleagues, until they lock in billing arrangements. This isn't out of spite, but to guard against client poaching. Similarly, startup founders often release information to investors in stages, carefully rationing access to build anticipation. In both scenarios, The withholding of information isn't arbitrary. It's about preserving leverage. Colin Cameron, a behavioral economist, has done studies on how strategic information sharing affects people. His findings suggest that even giving away some information can drastically change how others react. A well-placed piece of data, framed just right, can heavily influence their understanding. This is the reason for executive summaries. Most decision makers don't go through full reports. They rely on these carefully constructed summaries. For an employee without strong support, this presents both a challenge and a chance. Letting others summarize what you've done means giving up control of your own story. On the other hand, if you create clear, strategic updates that show how your work lines up with the company's goals, you can shape how you're seen before any review boards meet. It might feel forced at first. Then you realize that everyone else is subtly doing the same thing. Influence builds up quietly before it becomes obvious because it's based on layers of information. By the time someone is publicly acknowledged as an authority, the power dynamics have been set for a long time. People who seem to rise to prominence suddenly have often been studying these power flows for years. Still, there's a risk. If you become too secretive, you might become paranoid. If you overdo the selective revealing of information, you risk losing trust. The difference between using information strategically and being manipulative is subtle, and it's often hard to see until you've crossed the line. So, an uneasy feeling sinks in a setting where backing is scarce. Information is more than just knowledge. It's a form of currency. The question isn't whether to be completely open. It's about deciding how much of yourself you're willing to keep hidden and how long you can do so before people start to see a pattern. If information is currency, then reputation is its exchange rate. You might have valuable insights, skills, and even good judgment, but if others don't see the value in them, your potential influence remains just that, potential. This is where the discomfort becomes sharper because you can shape perception long before the actual substance is checked. Back in 1920, psychologist Edward Thorndike first talked about what would later be called the halo effect. Military officers who rated soldiers on their looks also tended to rate them higher on things like intelligence and leadership, even when there was no real proof to support those higher ratings. Just one positive trait seemed to color the entire evaluation. Decades later, this effect has been seen again and again in hiring decisions, academic grading, and even political preferences. One strong signal can skew everything else. Inside organizations, this happens very efficiently. An employee who gives one impressive presentation to upper management can quickly become known as strategic. Small mistakes are overlooked. Meanwhile, another employee who makes one visible mistake might spend months trying to repair the damage to their reputation, even if their overall work is better. How someone performs is often viewed through the lens of that initial impression. I recall reviewing internal promotion data at a consulting firm. Candidates were graded on many skills. Yet in interviews, senior partners often brought up a single key moment, a time when a candidate handled a client crisis well or gave a confident keynote speech. That moment influenced all the following discussion. The halo effect wasn't meant to be malicious. It was just a way to simplify things mentally. Still, it meant that you could build a reputation by carefully controlling what others saw of you. A bias toward authority makes this even more skewed. In the 1960s, Stanley Milgram showed how ordinary people would administer what they thought were painful electric shocks just because someone in authority told them to. Later studies have tweaked the findings, but the main point remains. Perceived authority can override someone's own judgment. Titles, affiliations, Even visual cues can change how likely people are to obey. Modern media knows this well. A startup founder featured in a major news source is suddenly seen as a visionary, even before their company becomes profitable. Investment money flows not just to solid business metrics, but to perceived momentum. Media coverage comes before real confirmation. In some instances, the reputation creates the very resources that later justify that reputation. Think about how some founders create a specific image through selective interviews, minimalist clothing choices, and a carefully planned stage presence. The iconic black turtleneck, the deliberate pauses, the story of singular focus. Whether we're talking about Steve Jobs in the 80s and 90s, or more recent figures whose companies later fell apart under scrutiny, the method is similar. Image sets expectations. Expectations draw in money. The money then helps to maintain the image, at least for a while. For someone without backing, this can be unsettling. You're told to just be yourself. Authenticity is presented as a virtue. But being authentic without being strategic can make you invisible. In competitive fields like investment banking, politics, or fast-growing tech, people who don't actively shape their own story are passively defined by rumors and incomplete impressions. Psychological studies on how we present ourselves make the issue of authenticity more complicated. Research shows that people who are good at self-monitoring adjust their behavior to fit social expectations and are more likely to climb the corporate ladder. They pick up on social cues and adjust how they present themselves accordingly. People who are low in self-monitoring stay consistent across different settings, but often don't go far in environments where influence is key. I was surprised at how consistently this linked to career advancement across different industries. This is where accusations of manipulation come in. If you emphasize some accomplishments and hide others, is that deceitful? If you position yourself close to influential people, are you taking advantage of that association? The halo effect suggests that just being associated with someone can change how you're seen. Simply sitting next to a respected executive during a meeting can subtly increase how important you seem. Being quoted in a company memo can change how your colleagues view your skills. I've watched mid-level managers at big companies carefully orchestrate their exposure. They volunteer for projects that cut across departments, not because they love the work, but because it gets them speaking slots in front of executive teams. They practice short, impactful stories about their work, even if the impact is small. They make sure their names are in written summaries. None of this breaks any laws. None of it violates formal ethical rules. But it's a deliberate way to build a reputation. Employees who don't have this instinct are often confused. They think their achievements will speak for themselves. But achievements don't speak. They're interpreted. And interpretation is affected by the existing image. That's where the discomfort grows, because trying to shape how you're seen can feel like vanity at first. Then you realize that the people who don't bother are quietly sidelined. Media stories show a darker side to this. Some executives who were masters at controlling the narrative kept their company's value inflated for years before the underlying problems came to light. Public perception delayed any real examination. When the collapse happened, it seemed sudden, but in reality, the reputation had been used to push off accountability. So, the question becomes sharper. Is strategically presenting yourself a survival skill in unequal systems, or is it a step toward deceit? If you refuse to shape how you're perceived, you risk being misunderstood. If you actively shape it, you risk starting to believe your own lies. Reputation can come before results. It can also substitute for them, at least for a while. And once people start reacting to the image instead of the reality, it becomes harder than you'd expect to tell the two apart. If perception can be manufactured, and if that perception changes the flow of opportunity, then your own identity becomes partly strategic. The unsettling thought lingers. At what stage does creating value turn into faking it entirely? And who benefits while that line stays unclear? If reputation can be engineered and perception can be shaped, then the next weakness is emotional. Because once your image starts to matter, so does your reaction to how it's treated, and reactions are where you're most likely to lose control. Research on how we regulate our emotions and how well our brains function makes this uncomfortable. Studies using brain scans in the early 2000s showed that people who actively reframe emotional triggers, for example, seeing an insult as unimportant, show more activity in the front part of their brain and less activity in the emotional center. In simple terms, thinking controls emotional reactions. Those who can't control their emotions stay emotionally charged for longer. As a result, they make worse decisions. Similar patterns show up in research on high-stakes negotiations. Analyses of labor disputes and corporate mergers at Harvard's program on negotiation show that negotiators who react emotionally to provocations give up more under pressure. They take attacks personally, while those who are more calculated treat them as just part of the process. When one side gets aggressive, the other side's calmness can shift the perceived power. Silence after an aggressive statement often gets more concessions than arguing back. I've seen this in boardroom showdowns. A chief financial officer publicly criticizes a project leader during a quarterly review. The project leader gets flustered, defends too aggressively, and over-explains. The room tenses up. Weeks later, that leader is quietly removed from important projects. In another case, a senior manager faced with similar criticism pauses, asks for clarification, and schedules a follow-up with more data. They show no visible emotion. The meeting ends without any drama. The manager keeps their position. The difference wasn't competence. It was emotional control. Here's something that's rarely said out loud. Emotional volatility shows vulnerability. Vulnerability attracts pressure. In competitive settings, private equity firms, political campaigns, high-stakes legal battles, opponents intentionally test your reactions. They leak a rumor, shift a deadline unexpectedly, or issue a public critique. The goal isn't to get information. It's to gauge you. How do you respond under stress? Psychologist Roy Baumeister's research suggested that self-control relies on limited mental resources, although later debates complicated how strong that effect really is. Still, real-world observations confirm something practical. After a lot of emotional strain, it's harder to control your impulses. An employee without support, already without protective allies, can't afford public slip-ups. There's no safety net, no one to reinterpret their outburst as passion. But empathy makes this more complex. Corporate culture publicly praises emotional intelligence. Leaders are told to be open, to express what they feel, to connect with their teams. Studies on transformational leadership show that communication that is empathetic increases team unity. This is true, but context matters. Showing empathy upward is different from showing it downward. Being emotionally open with subordinates can humanize authority, but showing vulnerability to competitors can weaken your negotiating position. Research on divorce mediation in high-conflict situations shows similar patterns. People who let go of the need to win emotionally often get better settlements. Those who insist on feeling morally justified prolong the legal battle and spend more money. This doesn't mean suppressing feelings. It means delaying expression until they have leverage. For someone without support, emotional attachments can become subtly dangerous. Attachment to being liked, to being understood, to narratives about fairness. These attachments can be triggered by opponents. A colleague suggests you're selfish, and you rush to prove that you're generous. A rival questions your loyalty, and you overcommit to prove your allegiance. Emotional hooks can redirect strategy. I was surprised at how quickly emotional restraint can change perception. At one tech startup I observed, two co-founders were arguing over how to split the company's equity. One argued heatedly, bringing up shared sacrifices and friendship. The other listened, asked for time to review the legal details, and came back with a well-structured proposal based on market standards. The investors sided with the composed founder, not because he was more ethical, but because he seemed more in control. Here, the tone shifts. Emotional detachment isn't warmth, it's calculation. You carefully decide when to show enthusiasm and when to hide reaction. You recognize that being seen as hurt can be exploited, so you train yourself to pause before reacting to provocation. Over time, this pause becomes instinct, but there's a price. Studies on emotional suppression show that constantly stopping yourself from expressing feelings can increase physical stress and weaken relationships. People who are detached might gain strategic clarity while losing personal connections. Their inner experience becomes narrower and more focused on achieving goals. The unsupported individual faces a stark choice. Without allies, emotional mistakes carry bigger consequences, so detachment becomes a way to perform better. You treat criticism as information and praise as temporary. You monitor your own reactions as carefully as you monitor others. Then, a colder question appears. If you learn to detach from others strategically, do you also start detaching from yourself? At what point does emotional control stop being discipline and start becoming distance? Not just from conflict, but from your own convictions. If emotional control creates distance, the next fracture is sharper because at some point restraint isn't enough. There are times when inaction costs more than confrontation, and this is where most people break, not from a lack of ability, but from not being willing to act against their own image of themselves. Research on dominance hierarchies in social psychology and biology can be difficult to digest. Studies of primate groups, and later of human organizations, show that status isn't maintained by skill alone. It's maintained by credible signals that you're willing to enforce your position. In experiments on group cooperation, people who were willing to punish those who broke the rules, even at a personal cost, were more likely to become stable leaders. Groups unconsciously track who is capable of decisively enforcing rules. In corporate environments, this plays out during tough times like restructuring. During the 2008 financial crisis, some big companies faced the very real risk of going out of business. Some executives delayed layoffs to keep morale high and protect the company's image. Others cut jobs aggressively within weeks. The second group was often called ruthless. Still, after the crisis, the firms that acted quickly often stabilized faster, preserving their core assets while competitors hesitated. I was surprised at how often timing, not compassion, determined how these survival stories were told. For middle managers, the experience is different. Imagine being responsible for a team of 12 people and being told that 4 positions have to be eliminated. The accepted way to do this emphasizes empathy, long conversations, and reassurance, but the underlying calculation is colder, delaying the inevitable signals uncertainty. Prolonged ambiguity makes everyone on the team more anxious. When a manager hesitates too much to avoid being disliked, productivity drops, rumors spread, and political maneuvering fills the silence. There's research to back up this discomfort. Studies on leadership during times of crisis show that followers prefer decisive action, even when the outcomes are painful. Ambiguity during a crisis increases stress and perceived instability. Decisiveness lowers uncertainty, even if the decision itself is harsh. The paradox is clear. People might resent the leader personally, but still depend on their decisiveness. History offers similar examples. During the American Civil War, Abraham Lincoln fired numerous generals before finally appointing Ulysses S. Grant, who pursued relentless campaigns despite high casualties. The decision was controversial and criticized as brutal, but the asymmetry of determination changed the course of the war. This isn't glorifying ruthlessness. It's recognizing that in conflict, hesitation can prolong damage more than concentrated force. The unsupported individual faces a quieter version of this dilemma. You realize that someone inside your organization is subtly undermining you, withholding information or questioning your skills in private conversations. You can ignore it, hoping professionalism will win out, or you can confront it directly, which raises the tension. The fear isn't the conflict itself. It's being labeled aggressive, difficult, or uncooperative. I've watched high-performing employees lose ground because they refuse to document problems, raise concerns, or explicitly defend their territory. They thought their skills would protect them. Meanwhile, more assertive colleagues framed the situation early, set boundaries, and forced clarity. This wasn't cruelty, it was boundary enforcement. Studies of dominance hierarchies among adolescents reveal something similar. Students who respond to minor social violations with calm but firm pushback are less likely to experience ongoing issues. Those who avoid confrontation, hoping to maintain harmony, often attract continued testing of boundaries. This pattern extends into adult workplaces. Controlled ruthlessness doesn't mean being indiscriminately aggressive. It means being asymmetrical in your resolve. You act once, clearly and proportionally, so that repetition becomes unnecessary. This is the nuance that most people miss. They equate any show of force with moral failure, or they overcorrect and turn erratic. There's also a reputational aspect. Leaders who are seen as incapable of making hard decisions lose strategic credibility. During merger negotiations, executives who signal they're unwilling to walk away often get worse terms. Negotiation theory confirms this repeatedly. Credibly threatening to leave increases bargaining power. However, credibility requires the psychological ability to accept short-term dislike. I remember observing a startup founder who faced a conflict with a co-founder that was hurting performance. Advisors suggested mediation. Months passed, and tension increased. Eventually, the founder executed a buyout, forcing the co-founder out. The public reaction within the company was mixed. Some saw it as a betrayal. However, within a year, the clarity of leadership stabilized operations. The emotional cost was real, but indecision would likely have been worse. This is the uncomfortable heart of the matter. Winning without support sometimes requires acting in ways that disrupt how you see yourself. You might need to remove allies who aren't performing, reject proposals from friends, or publicly walk away from negotiations. The underlying fear behind hesitation is simple. If they dislike me, I'll lose my sense of belonging. Still, if you prioritize belonging over position in competitive environments, you risk becoming irrelevant. Irrelevance, unlike dislike, rarely announces itself loudly. It accumulates quietly until your influence is gone. Controlled ruthlessness isn't about cruelty. It's about carefully enforcing boundaries and demonstrating, once, that those boundaries are real. Every act of enforcement leaves a mark. Relationships shift and trust recalibrates. So, the question gets sharper. Can you act decisively without needing to be understood? If you can, who do you become in the process? Someone who protects their position, or someone who others begin to fear? If decisive action reshapes your immediate surroundings, the next realization is even less personal, because eventually you see that individual moves, restraint, opacity, calibrated aggression only matter within a larger structure. If you don't understand that structure, you're still just reacting. Network theory makes this clear. In the late 1990s, Albert Laszlo Barabasi and Rika Albert showed that many real-world networks follow a structure where a small number of points accumulate a disproportionate number of connections. The distribution isn't linear. It follows a power law. In social systems, this means that influence concentrates. A small group of people controls access to opportunities, information, and resources. I remember seeing a visualization of email traffic inside a global company. Thousands of employees were shown as points on a map. Most had modest connectivity, but a few acted as hubs connecting departments, filtering communication, speeding up some initiatives while slowing others. These hubs weren't always the highest-ranking employees, but structurally, they were essential. This is the intersection where individual effort meets structural leverage. You can increase your productivity endlessly, but if your work circulates within a point that doesn't have many connections, its overall impact stays limited. Meanwhile, someone positioned at a network intersection can amplify even average work. Research on wealth distribution reflects this pattern. Studies of income and asset ownership repeatedly show that a small percentage of people hold a large percentage of the wealth. The exact numbers vary by country and year, but the curve remains skewed. This isn't just about talent or effort. It's also about compounding advantage. Early access to resources generates returns that increase future access. Structural position reinforces itself. Within organizations, similar compounding happens. A mid-level employee assigned to a cross-functional task force gains exposure to senior leadership. That exposure leads to future invitations, which increase their centrality. Within a few years, that employee becomes seen as more indispensable than peers who might be more skilled but structurally isolated. Common organizational behaviors reinforce this asymmetry. Organizations don't operate purely on written rules. They develop unofficial alliances. Budget approvals depend on relationships, and promotions require sponsorship. Even in seemingly meritocratic academic departments, tenure decisions often reflect internal voting groups. I've seen committees discuss candidates less in terms of their academic work and more in terms of how they align with the department and its long-term strategy. Theory here gives way to political reality. This is where the psychological tools we talked about earlier reveal their systemic purpose. Emotional detachment helps maintain clear thinking during conflicts, and reputation engineering increases the chances of being invited into influential groups. Controlling information protects your position within competitive networks, and controlled ruthlessness signals that you can defend against encroachment. Without system awareness, these behaviors feel defensive. With it, they become a way to shape the environment. Consider how venture capital ecosystems operate. Founders embedded in high-status networks secure introductions to investors who rarely review unsolicited applications. The probability of funding depends less on the raw strength of the idea and more on how close you are to the right networks. Sociologist Ronald Burt's idea of structural holes explains part of this. People who connect disconnected groups gain information and have brokerage power, making them necessary intermediaries. For the unsupported individual, this realization is both freeing and unsettling. You're not just competing on skills, you're competing for structural position. The question changes from how can I improve to where am I positioned and which connections increase my centrality. I was surprised at how often institutions resist openly acknowledging this reality. Formal narratives emphasize teamwork and flat structures, but network analyses consistently reveal bottlenecks and gatekeepers. Ignoring these realities doesn't make them disappear, it just makes sure you stay on the periphery. Systems thinking also changes how you understand conflict. A disagreement with a colleague is rarely just a personal issue. It often reflects competition between groups, departments protecting their budgets, or leaders protecting their future career paths. When you treat conflict as a personal insult, you misread the structure. There's a Machiavellian logic here, though without the romanticism that usually comes with it. Power isn't something you possess, it's your position within a web of dependencies. To increase your power, you change those dependencies, both yours and those of others. You become someone others rely on, or you attach yourself to those who already command resources. Winning without support, then, is less about heroic isolation and more about strategic integration. You design your environment so that removing you would be costly. That's leverage at the structural level. Systems thinking carries a colder implication. If you view institutions as structures rather than communities, relationships become partly strategic and trust becomes partly tactical. You begin to map out influence the way engineers map supporting beams. Here's where the final tension emerges. Once you see the structure, you can't unsee it. The game is no longer about individual moves. It's about designing the board itself. The question is no longer whether you can win without support, but whether you can build a position so embedded in the system that support becomes a byproduct, and whether, in doing so, you gradually become indistinguishable from the structure you once resisted. If systems thinking reveals the structure, then the final step is integration. All the parts we've been discussing, isolation, moral flexibility, information control, reputation engineering, emotional detachment, controlled ruthlessness, come together into a single operating principle. Winning without support is less about heroics and more about aligning with the invisible currents of power. It isn't about becoming Machiavellian in some simplistic way. It's about understanding that the currents exist whether you acknowledge them or not. Isolation teaches self-reliance, but self-reliance alone isn't enough. Experiments on learned helplessness and self-efficacy show that people who can act independently are still vulnerable if they misunderstand feedback from their environment. Without moral flexibility, someone who isolates themselves might stay reactive, held back by unrealistic expectations of fairness. That's where the shift toward calculated adaptability becomes key. Ethical rigidity doesn't create leverage. Selective adaptation does. The actions of Otto von Bismarck in 19th century Europe illustrate this. His policies were driven by power and advantage rather than moral ideals, yet he maintained legitimacy long enough to achieve systemic results. Controlling information, in turn, compounds your advantages. Behavioral economics and intelligence both agree that those who manage information flow, selectively share it, and interpret patterns before others do gain a big edge. Business cases from tech and finance show that early access to decisions, used quietly, can transform someone from being on the outside to being a necessary part of things. Reputation engineering boosts this effect. Halo effects, authority bias, and strategic self-presentation make sure that even small accomplishments are seen as important. A well-positioned person becomes not just skilled, but structurally valuable in the eyes of their colleagues and decision-makers. The line between perception and reality blurs, but influence grows. Emotional detachment helps with execution. Negotiation studies and analyses of high-stakes situations demonstrate that those who control their reactions stay mentally clear under pressure. The unsupported person can't afford to show empathy toward provocations that could weaken their position. Controlled responses, calibrated openness, and measured pauses become tools. The cost is psychological. Studies on chronic suppression point to accumulated stress and weaker relationships. However, without this control, their leverage collapses before it can be used. Controlled ruthlessness consolidates advantages. Corporate restructuring and research on dominance hierarchies both show that decisive action, even if socially awkward, secures influence that indecision gives away. The unsupported person must sometimes enforce boundaries, make difficult decisions, and act without seeking approval. Historical examples from military and political contexts reinforce that delay, inaction, and moral hesitation are far more dangerous than the ethical discomfort of action. Still, all of these things operate within systems. Network theory, power law distributions, and organizational patterns show that individual skill or bravery matters most when used within structural leverage. Someone in the wrong network stays invisible. A peripheral person's ruthlessness is ineffective. Systems amplify those who understand the structure and weaken those who only focus on day-to-day tactics. The Machiavellian person, therefore, combines tactical skills with strategic positioning. Awareness of structure allows for long-term influence, even without formal support. The advice of Niccolò Machiavelli in The Prince comes back here, not as a rule book, but as a way of seeing things, understand how power works, anticipate human behavior, and act decisively. Compare this to moral idealism. Acting solely on fairness, kindness, or ethical principles rarely creates influence in competitive environments. Case after case in the business world, in politics, and in history shows that outcomes are driven by leverage, perception, and timing, not by moral consistency. Recognizing this doesn't mean abandoning your morals. It means being honest about how systems operate. This kind of integration has a psychological cost. Emotional labor, deliberate detachment, and suppressing instincts all add up. However, the cost of ignoring these things, being reactive, peripheral, or morally inflexible in environments that reward decisiveness and positioning, is invisibility, irrelevance, and a quiet erosion of your own agency. Psychological studies on stress, how we see ourselves, and social evaluation confirm that awareness alone isn't enough. You need to consciously apply these principles to maintain influence. So, winning without support isn't about becoming ruthless. It's about understanding, aligning yourself, and acting precisely. You act where others hesitate, see what others misunderstand, and position yourself where a lack of backing would otherwise doom you. This process requires constant alertness because power continues to operate even when you're not there. Its currents don't take sides. The ultimate question remains: if you refuse to play strategically, navigate the systems, and combine detachment with leverage, are you upholding your morals or quietly choosing to be irrelevant? That question lingers, not as a judgment or instruction, but as a silent measure against which all unsupported efforts are judged. The system waits, indifferent, and the individual must decide whether understanding alone is enough or whether action, however uncomfortable, is unavoidable.